first 5 books of the Bible. And I was just looking at the lessons that we have gone through for the past almost 5 years. And during that period of time, we've covered 25 of the 39 books of the Old Testament, or about 65% of the Old Testament. And some of the books that we didn't cover are Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, which the pastor has talked about, and Isaiah and Ezekiel. But pretty much most of the other books of the Bible we've covered. So hopefully when we've gone through the Old Testament, you've gained appreciation of the scriptures dealing with the scriptures that foretell and previewed the work of Jesus Christ. The whole Bible is about God's plan of salvation, which is fulfilled through the person of Jesus Christ, God becoming man, dying on the cross, being resurrected, ascending back to heaven. And then we all, as Christians in the New Testament, await his return and the establishment of his kingdom on earth, and eventually the new heavens and new earth that is promised to us. I call this lesson Final Words and Final Lessons because this is the end of the book of Deuteronomy, where Moses finishes giving the messages which God inspired him to tell the people of Israel, and goes on the top of Mount Nebo and dies. And so we're going to go back a little bit to the previous lesson, starting with chapter 27, and we're going to go from chapter 27 through chapter 34 of the book of Deuteronomy. And as we mentioned several times before, the book of Deuteronomy contains the last words spoken by Moses to the Israelites before he died. Now we're going to change a little bit about the group discussion, because there are going to be more open-ended questions, basically to draw out some of the things that you may have gotten out of the study of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And in this discussion, we'll draw out characteristics and things that we learned about God, and characteristics and things that we learned about Moses. And I need to emphasize that these discussion questions are really not designed to have a precise right and wrong answer. They're supposed to trigger your discussion and reinforce points that we've already learned. And I use the discussion answers that you give, the responses, to highlight things that you say that are important to get out of the lessons that we have. So before we get started, I want to review really the last 2 lessons of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses' first and second messages to the Israelites, and then introduce this week's lesson. Now, in our last 2 lessons, we focused on the first 2 messages. I call them epilogues, postscripts, which Moses delivered to the Israelites before he died. In the first message, Moses reviewed significant historical events which took place after the first generation of Israelites who God had delivered from Egypt, from when they departed Mount Sinai up to the time that they defeated the Amorite kingdoms of Sihon and Og, waged a holy war against Moab, and arrived at the plains of Moab to prepare for the conquest of the promised land. So it really covered historical events from Mount Sinai to the plains of Moab. Moses used these historical events to illustrate the necessity for the Israelites to love God and to demonstrate their love for God by being obedient to God's commands. Moses explained that whenever the Israelites disobeyed God's command, God imposed his judgment and punishment on them by sending plagues, opening up the earth, and by not allowing the first generation to enter into the promised land. Moses also explained that when the Israelites obeyed God's command, God gave them victory over the kingdoms of Sihon, Og, and Moab. So he used these historical examples to really emphasize the value and blessings that come from obedience and the consequences for non-obedience to God's commands. In his second message, Moses, as a lawgiver, gave the second generation of Israelites a detailed and comprehensive explanation of the laws which God had given to the first generation of Israelites during the time that they spent at Mount Sinai. Before discussing the law, Moses emphasized that the stipulations, commandments, statutes, and judgments which Israel received from God were foundational, or the underlying basis for the Sinaitic covenant, which the nation of Israel had entered into with God at Mount Sinai. Moses told the Israelites that God's law started with the 10 commandments, with the first 4 commandments defining Israel's relationship with God, and the last 6 commandments defining Israel's relationship with others. After explaining the 10 commandments, Moses spoke in detail about all the other stipulations, laws, regulations, and rules which God required of the Israelites in order for them to be God's holy people and to receive God's blessings. Now, we mentioned very quickly in chapter 27 of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses instructed the Israelites that after they entered into the promised land, they were to write the laws which God had given to them on large stone pillars, obelisks, much like the Egyptians made, covered with plaster, to build an altar on top of Mount Ebal and make burnt offerings to God, and place the stone pillars on top of Mount Ebal as a remembrance of the law which God had given to them. After the Israelites crossed the Jordan, Moses instructed the Levites and leaders from 6 of the tribes of Israel, Reuben, and Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali, who all descended from Leah's maidservant Zippah and from Rachel's maidservant Bilhah, to stand on Mount Ebal and shout out curses which would come upon the people as a result of their disobedience. He also instructed the other Levites and leaders from the other 6 tribes of Israel who descended from Leah and Rachel, that's Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin, to stand on Mount Gerizim and shout out to the people the blessings the people would receive if they remained obedient to God. Now, Mount Ebal was located north of Shechem in central Canaan. And if you recall, Shechem is where Abraham first made an altar to God after arriving in Canaan. Mount Gerizim was located south of Shechem. So Shechem was in the valley between these 2 mountains. And the valley was about 6 miles wide. In chapter 27 of the book of Deuteronomy, the scriptures only stated the curses which were to be shouted from Mount Ebal. While the blessings for obedience are stated in chapter 28, they are not given in chapter 27, where Moses is giving the Israelites instructions regarding the ceremony which would take place after the Israelites had entered the promised land. I did some research as to why in chapter 27, where he's discussing the ceremony and the shouting from the 2 mountaintops, only the curses were given. And as we're going to see in this lesson, Moses was given insight from God that Israel would fail in their obedience to God, and that it was likely, in fact, it was God already foretold that Israel would not be obedient and that they would receive the curses. And that is a reason why in chapter 27, the blessings are not mentioned. Moses concluded his second message in chapter 28 of the book of Deuteronomy by explaining to the Israelites the blessings which God promised they would receive if they obeyed God, and the curses which God promised would come upon them if they did not obey God. Now, in last week's study, we focused on the greatest commandment which Moses highlighted in his second message to the Israelites, which is found in chapter 6 of the book of Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. Jesus affirmed that Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 5, the Shema, was the greatest of the commandments when he was asked by the scribe sent by the Pharisees to trick him into division or opposition to Moses. Jesus in Mark 12, verses 29 and 30 said, "The most important commandment," answered Jesus, "is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength." After affirming Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 5 as the greatest of the commandments, Jesus added the second greatest commandment, saying, "The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. The overriding theme in Moses' second message to the Israelites was God's command for the Israelites to love God and to love each other. The message from last week's lesson was that loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength does not happen overnight. It starts with a person acknowledging God as the one and only true God and develops as one learns about who God is and experiences God in their lives. Learning to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength is part of being sanctified and ultimately requires the believer to wholeheartedly deny himself, pick up his cross, and follow Jesus. So those are the first two messages in summary. The first one, using historical examples to show the reason why it is better to obey God than disobey God. And then second, talking about all the laws of God, but the overriding theme was to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. This week, we'll focus on the final words which Moses delivered to the Israelites, which included his third ominous and prophetic message, his song, and his blessing on the tribes of Israel. We will conclude the study with a summary of what we learned about the character of God and the character of Moses from the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The main message that I want you to get from tonight's lesson is that despite Israel's past and future disobedience and apostasy, God, in his steadfast and faithful fulfillment of his promises and his plan for the redemption of Israel and the world, will restore Israel to the promised land and will change Israel's heart so they will no longer disobey his commands. By way of outline, it's broken down into two parts. Part one, Moses' final words to the Israelites before his death, which will consist of Moses' final words to the Israelites and then Moses' death itself. And then part two, following the format before, the discussion questions, concluding with implications, conclusions, and applications. So let's get to the study for tonight's lesson. Moses' final words to the Israelites before his death. Moses' final words to the Israelites. Moses' final words consisted of 5 separate messages. Moses' third message to the people, Moses' instructions on the book of the law, Moses' song, Moses' message to all creation, and Moses' blessing on the tribes of Israel. So let's talk about the first of the 5 final words that Moses gave to the Israel. Moses' third message to the Israelites revealed the new covenant between God and Israel. What would you tell your children if God revealed to you that your grandchildren and great-grandchildren would turn away from God and face God's judgment and promise? So what would you tell your children if God already gave you the prophecy that your grandchildren and great-grandchildren would turn away from God and be punished? Despite knowing the disobedience and apostasy of the future generations of the Israelites, Moses revealed to the people God's faithfulness and promise that he would ultimately enter into a new covenant with their descendants, giving them knowledge of the true God and transforming their hearts into the hearts of obedience. So, despite Moses being told by God that the future generations of the Israelites, after they settled into the promised land, would turn away from God, worship other gods, and be punished, ultimately being taken out of the promised land, that they would return, and then the apostasy would return, and then they would be taken out of the promised land and dispersed throughout the world. Moses jumps ahead to the end times when God is going to enter into a new covenant with Israel, and he will bring Israel back into the promised land. He will change their hearts so that they believe in the one true God and that their hearts will wholeheartedly be obedient to God's commands. So Moses began his third message by affirming the covenant relationship between Israel and God. Now, most biblical scholars believe that Moses' third message to the Israelites reaffirmed the covenant which God had made with the first generation of Israelites at Mount Sinai. In other words, they look at it as a reaffirmation of the Sinaitic covenant. Other biblical scholars believe that Moses was introducing a new covenant to the second generation of Israelites. This view is supported by the fact that the first generation had broken the covenant which they had entered into with God at Mount Sinai by disobeying God's commands, especially the command to enter into and conquer the promised land. This view is also supported by the words used by Moses that this new covenant was besides or in addition to the Sinaitic covenant. If the covenant which Moses spoke about in his third message to the Israelites was different than the covenant that the Sinaitic covenant that was entered into by the Israelites at Mount Sinai, then the biblical scholars who hold this view refer to this different covenant as a Palestinian covenant. So there's not much difference except that the second generation actually takes possession in fulfillment of God's promise and is required to be obedient to God with the laws that apply to the promised land. But those that accept the view that this is a little different covenant call it the Palestinian covenant instead of a renewal of the Sinaitic covenant. In his third message, Moses contrasted God's faithfulness to Israel's spiritual blindness, telling the Israelites that obedience to God's commands necessitated them to have a change of heart. So Moses, knowing that Israel will not be obedient to God's commands and that they will commit apostasy and be punished by God, is telling them that what you need is a change in your heart. And that heart change has to be from the inner self, not the outer works of the law. Moses then prophesies that in the future, Israel will see God's judgment against Israel because of their disobedience and apostasy, comparing the future generation of Israelites to Sodom, which God destroyed. So he's laying it out for them. He's saying, you're about ready to take possession of the promised land, fulfilling God's promise, but you're going to fall away and you're going to see God's judgment. And God's judgment is no different than Sodom, which God destroyed. Many scholars say that before Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, it was the closest thing to the Garden of Eden. And then when God destroyed it, it was never occupied again. In fact, we have trouble locating the exact location of Sodom and Gomorrah. Moses told the Israelites that the rejection of God by their descendants will result in God's rejection of them, resulting in the removal from the promised land and dispersion throughout the Gentile world. Then Moses looked even further into the future, foretelling of the new covenant which God will enter into with Israel. In this new covenant, Israel will repent, turns towards God, and recognize and be given knowledge of the one true God who will lead them into a wholehearted commitment of obedience to God's commandments and the end of Israel's distress. So Moses is jumping way forward in his prophecy to the end times when Jesus returns and restores Israel and changes the hearts of the Israelite. In this new covenant, God will transform the hearts of Israel's descendants, giving them a heart of obedience and restoring Israel's covenant relationship with God, when Israel will be gathered and restored to the promised land, and God will rule over them forever, and Israel's enemies will be punished. This is a new covenant for the ultimate salvation of Israel by faith in Christ, spoken about in the Old Testament by the prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Zephaniah, Zechariah, and Malachi, and affirmed by the Apostle Paul in the New Testament in Romans. If you want to have a grouping of all the prophecies in the Old Testament pointing to the end time when God will restore Israel to the promised land and God will reign on earth and Israel will be vindicated, gathered back into the promised land, and have a change of heart, accepting Jesus Christ as the Lord. All of these testaments are the key Old Testament scriptures that I reference here, are all the Old Testament ones that relate to that future prophecy. But it starts with Moses in this third message. So that's basically the third message. It's a prophetic message. It's a message that talks about the future generations of Israel's, the generations that turn away from God and are punished, to the final generation which accepts Jesus Christ as the Savior and is restored to the promised land. Now we're going to get to the second message that Moses gave to the Israelites. Moses' instructions regarding the book of the law, telling the Israelites that he was 120 years old. Moses wrote down the book of the law and instructed the priests to read the book of the law to the people during the Feast of Tabernacles every 7 years in the sabbatical year. The sabbatical year is every 7 years. And during that Feast of the Tabernacles, the book of the law were to be read to the people. Now, scholars hold a different view as to whether or not the book of the law referred to by Moses in Deuteronomy 31, verses 9 through 13, contain Moses' messages in the book of Deuteronomy, or the entire Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible from Genesis through Deuteronomy. I couldn't get a majority minority view, but my sense of it from the literature I read is that the majority believed that the book of the law was the entire 5 books of the Old Testament, first 5 books. Now Moses instructed the Israelites to place the book of the law in the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle and later in the temple next to the Ark of the Covenant, which contained the 2 tablets inscribed with the 10 commandments. So something that we haven't discussed before is Moses' instruction for the book of the law to be placed in the Holy of Holies and then kept next to the Ark of the Covenant. So those are his instructions regarding the book of the law. The third message which Moses gave to the Israelites is Moses' ominous and prophetic song. After concluding his third message to the Israelites, Moses gave the Israelites his prophetic and poetic revelation about Israel's apostasy, which will bring upon them God's certain judgment. This prophecy is referred to as Moses' song, or the Song of Moses. The introduction to Moses' song, Deuteronomy 31, verses 1 through 6, contrasted the steadfast faithfulness of God to the fickle and disobedience response of the nation of Israel. So he starts out by saying, God is steadfast, he's a promise keeper, and Israel is fickle and disobedient. The remainder of Moses' song described Israel's past, future, and ultimate restoration with God. So what we're seeing here is in the final words that Moses gave to the Israelites, what he covered in the third message was also emphasized in Moses' song. The song described God's election of Israel as his chosen people. That's verses 8 and 9 of chapter 31. God's care for and provision to Israel when they're journeying through the wilderness. That's the verses 10 through 12 of chapter 31. And Israel's possession and initial enjoyment of God's blessing in the promised land. That's verses 13 and 14 of chapter 31. The Song of Moses then continued describing Israel's rejection of God's goodness and her disobedience and apostasy. Deuteronomy verses 15 and 16 of chapter 31, resulting in God's wrath and punishment, verses 19 through 27 of chapter 31, and Israel's spiritual blindness despite receiving God's wrath, judgment, and punishment, Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses 28 through 33. What's emphasized in Moses' song about Israel's spiritual blindness is that it reached a point where Israel purposely kept Israel spiritually blind. Even today, Israel is spiritually blind to the truth. It is not until the end of times when Jesus returns that God will lift the blindness of the nation of Israel and then will recognize Jesus as their Messiah and as their God, and that they will come to worship him and be obedient to his commands. Moses then prophesies that God will take away Israel's possession of the promised land in order to turn the nation of Israel from idolatry. That's in verses 34 through 38 of chapter 31. Then Moses revealed that God will ultimately visit his judgment against both the Gentile nations and against Israel. We're really talking about the tribulation, the time of Jacob's trouble. It is not only the time that all the Gentile nations will receive God's wrath and judgment, but it'll be the time of Jacob's trouble when Israel itself will go through the tribulation. And this is what it's going to take before the spiritual blindness is lifted and Jesus is recognized as the Son of God and Messiah. Moses ended his song with a message calling for all the Gentile nations to rejoice with Israel because God will punish all of God's enemies, spiritually heal the nation of Israel, and restore Israel to the promised land. And that's verse 43 of Deuteronomy 31. So chapter 31 is the Song of Moses. And you can see that he goes through the future of Israel, but he emphasizes ultimately after the tribulation, Israel will be restored, God's enemies will be punished, and the entire world will rejoice at the coming of Jesus Christ and the worldwide acknowledgement that Jesus is the Son of God. After the Song of Moses, Moses gave a message to all of God's creation. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, Moses called for all of God's creation to hear the message Moses was giving to Israel. So even though in his final words, Moses was speaking to the second generation of Israelites, he was really calling for all of God's creation to listen to the message that he's giving to the Israelites. He did this because God's plans for Israel will ultimately affect all of God's creation. Moses' message to Israel will impact all the nations on earth as well as the entire universe when God will create a new heaven and earth. God's ultimate plan is that the heaven and earth as we know it will pass away, and he will create a new heaven and earth, and that his people will live with him eternally. Moses' final words to Israel emphasized that his messages regarding Israel were a lesson to all of God's creation, revealing, and the point of his message to all creation, speaking to all creation, is that the glory and honor of God as a creator, which he revealed to Israel by his acts of omnipotence, which Israel and all sinners rejected and dishonored, demonstrated the steadfastness, God as a rock, eternal presence, sovereignty, authority, and unchanging nature of God, in contrast to the foolishness, stupidity, and rebellion of the nation of Israel and all the other nations. So what he's saying is that the very character of God as a creator has been revealed to Israel, and through Israel is revealed to the entire world and God's creation. The second part of the emphasis is the message to all of creation justifies the righteousness and just God who will deal with his creation in the same manner he dealt with Israel, who God described as the apple of his eye, and who he demonstrated his loving care like an eagle who cares for its young as they are learning to fly. The young eaglets would be learning to fly. They would get tired and start to fall from the air, and the eagle would spread its wings, and the eaglets would fall on the wings, and the loving care of the protection of the eagle. And so Moses is saying Israel was the apple of God's eye, and God cared for Israel like an eagle cares for its young eaglets. And if he could punish Israel, then the rest of the world better listen. Because if the apple of his eye would receive God's judgment, what about the entire creation that was disobedient to God? And so, because Israel failed to live up to God's law and fell into apostasy by worshiping false no gods, God used the Gentile nations to punish the Israelites whenever they turned to idol worship, ultimately turning Israel into a no nation. So Moses used the words, "You worship no gods, now you're a no nation." And all this time while he's punishing Israel, Moses says he was storing up his wrath against the nations, the Gentile nations that God used to punish Israel. And we've seen this when we studied the Old Testament, how he called the Assyrians to punish the northern kingdom, the Babylonians to punish the southern kingdom, and then his stored up wrath was against the Assyrians and the Babylonians, who God punished. God is not mocked. And so he stores up wrath against wrongdoing, even though he may use sinners and Gentile nations to fulfill his plan in punishing Israel. The third point that Moses made in his message to all of creation was that God's ultimate reconciliation with his creation will be manifested in heaven and earth by God's judgment against the wicked and by God's salvation of those who are faithful to God and believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. God's earthly and eternal punishment of sinners will vindicate those who have and remain faithful to God through the atonement of Christ, who will usher in a new heaven and earth. And so these are the three parts where Moses is saying, I've talked to Israel, but pay attention, all of God's creation. What happens to Israel is just a sign of what's going to happen to you, because God is going to vindicate his righteousness, his judgment, and he's going to reconcile creation by punishing all wickedness and restoring those who have believed in him. So that's the fourth message that Moses gave. And the final and fifth message is Moses' blessings on the tribes of Israel, suggesting that Moses was a prototype of Jesus as a coming prophet king, like unto Moses. And this is one of the scriptures in Deuteronomy where Moses is referred to as a king, even though he was never a king. He certainly fulfilled a lot of the roles of a king by ruling over Israel as God's servant, and that Moses was a man of God. So these are two things that are mentioned when he gives his blessings to the tribes of Israel, that he is a prophet king like unto Moses, similar to what Jesus, foretelling what Jesus is going to be, a prophet king, and that Moses was a man of God. The final words Moses to the Israelites contain Moses' prophetic blessings to the tribes of Israel. Most scholars believe that these blessings were most likely given by Joshua to Israel after Moses died. And this interpretation comes from the use of the phrase "he stated" or "Moses stated," indicating that Moses had revealed his blessings to Joshua before he died, and the blessings were delivered to the Israelites after Moses died. While Moses' blessings to the tribes of Israel revealed the prosperity, protection, security, military success, expansion, and sustainment which God will give to the tribes of the nation of Israel, the context of the text indicate that these blessings would not be fulfilled until the kingdom of the Messiah is established on earth. So what he did is he went through the different tribes, and unlike the blessings that Judah gave to the tribes before he died, the blessings that Moses gave were all positive. They're going to expand in number. They're going to prosper. They're going to have military success. They're going to have success in crops. They're going to have shipping, all these prosperity predictions. But in the context, most scholars believe that Moses is really not talking about the nation of Israel after it enters into the promised land and takes possession of it, but really at the time when Israel ultimately is restored to the promised land at the end of times. So those are the five messages that Moses gave in this final part of the book of Deuteronomy. And now we come to the very end of the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 34, which is Moses' death. After Moses delivered his final words, God told Moses to climb to the top of Mount Nebo, where he was allowed to look across the Jordan River and see the land that God had promised to give to the patriarchs and their descendants. Moses climbed to the top of Mount Nebo, and after seeing the promised land, Moses died. At the time of his death, Moses did not suffer from any physical health problems or terminal illness. His death did not result from any natural causes. It was a result of his unfaithfulness to the Lord at Meribah. That's where he struck the rock instead of speaking to it. The language of Deuteronomy 34:6, he buried him, suggests that the Lord is the one who buried Moses. In the book of Jude, verse 9, the scriptures describe a dispute between the archangel Michael and Satan over Moses' body. After Moses' death, the nation of Israel mourned for 30 days. So now that's the last chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, and we've come to the point where Moses climbs to the top of Mount Nebo, dies, is buried by God, and Israel mourns for 30 days. Joshua assumes leadership over the nation of Israel, the second generation. And in the next book of the Bible, the book of Joshua, that's when they enter under leadership of Joshua. they cross the Jordan River and enter into the promised land, conquering first Jericho and then conquering the 5 kings and ultimately taking possession of the land of Canaan. So that concludes the book of Deuteronomy. Now, part 2, we're going to talk lessons learned from the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So looking back over the first 5 books of the Bible, and all we studied with the book of Genesis about creation, about the call of Abraham, about the life of Abraham, and then the life of his son Isaac, and then the life of Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel, and then Israel going into Egypt, and then the book of Exodus, where Moses is called by God to lead Israel out of Egypt, the plagues on Egypt, the crossing of the Red Sea, the covenants given to the Israelites at Mount Sinai, the miracles performed by God in providing manna and providing for the Israelites as they journeyed through the wilderness, the punishments and disciplines of God through the plagues, the arrival of the second generation in the plains of Moab, the conquest of the kingdoms of Sihon and Og, and the defeat of the Moabs in the Holy War, and finally the messages that Moses gave. What I want you to do in these discussion questions is put it all to span of in his lifespan of 120 years, Moses spent 40 years of his life as someone, son of Pharaoh and the heir apparent to the throne, 40 years of his life as no one, a shepherd in the wilderness of Midian, and his final 40 years of his life as God's servant. So he is someone, no one, and then God's servant. As God's servant, Moses learned to love God with all of his heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love the people he led. Moses walked the talk. He did what he communicated to the people that God wanted his people to do. At the end of Moses' life, Moses humbly accepted God's punishment for his disobedience at Meribah, but continued to faithfully reveal God's messages to Israel and to the world about God's righteous punishment for Israel's disobedience to God's commands, apostasy, and turning to and worshiping false gods, and unfaithfulness to the promises which God made to them in the covenant relationship with God established. Moses' final messages and words to Israel as a nation prophetically revealed God's redemptive plan of salvation to the entire world, which was fulfilled by Jesus' death on the cross, resurrection, and ascension, and which will be completed upon Christ's return as a Messiah to Israel, and by Christ's establishment of his kingdom of God on earth. Moses prophesied the punishment of the wicked and the salvation of the righteous at the end of times, when God will completely destroy his creation as it currently exists and replace it with a new heaven and earth.
Very good, Bob. Thank you.
That was